Hello and welcome to the India Story. I'm Vikram Chandra, and this week on the show we have lots to talk about, both internationally and from India. One of our key focuses is, of course, on the escalating humanitarian crisis in Gaza as tensions in the region continue to rise over Israel's relentless strikes on the Gaza Strip. More than 3,000 civilians have reportedly died in the air attacks, and with the borders sealed and essential items depleting, innocent civilians are being caught up in this entire crisis. Now, of course, that crisis entirely was caused by that terrible terror attack by Hamas. Hamas, the organization and the body that governs the Gaza Strip. We're going to be talking about this at some length. How do you deal with terrorism? What does humanitarian law actually say? What does law and precedent say about how you should deal with terrorism? Joining me on the show is going to be Neve Gordon, Professor of Human Rights Law at the Queen Mary University of London. Amarjeet Singh Dulat is also going to be joining us, somebody who's been the Chief of RAW. What is the best way to deal with these sort of situations and to deal with terror? Meanwhile, a decision that's brought some heartbreak and pain to the Indian LGBTQ plus community. India's Supreme Court has denied legal marriage rights for same-sex couples and also the right to adoption. We're going to be discussing the nuances of this verdict with special guest Anjali Gopalan, human rights activist, is joining us. She's also the founder and executive director of the NAS Foundation. And Geeta Bhatt will be talking to us, professor at the University of Delhi. Also on the program, a verdict was delivered, but 17 years later, it seems that once again justice was denied. I'm speaking about the Natari killing acquittal, but this case dates back to 2005-2016, gruesome murders of 19 women and children, 14 kilometers from India's national capital, Delhi. A high court has now acquitted both the accused due to a lack of evidence, cancelling their death sentences and saying the entire investigation was done badly and in a shoddy manner. All of that puts the focus on the complexities of the Indian judicial system, the way police investigations are actually done, why all of this needs to be speeded up. Sanjay Hegde, senior advocate of the Supreme Court, will be joining us to take us through all the issues which are at play out here. But let's start with the situation in the Gaza Strip. After carrying out relentless airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has told his men to be ready for a ground offensive. Israel has, of course, massed tens of thousands of troops along the border with the Gaza Strip. All of this following the October 7 cross-border terrorist massacre by Hamas terrorists. Meeting Israel's infantry soldiers on the Gaza border, the Israeli Defense Minister urged the troops to be organized and be ready. He didn't, however, mention a time when the invasion would actually begin. As Israel continues to pound Gaza, new satellite images show a number of people taking shelter in schools and hospitals around Gaza City, and that obviously will have its own potential repercussions. We all know what happened with that incident at the hospital in Gaza, which created so many headlines and so much misinformation earlier this week. The biggest concern around the world, of course, is the possible expansion of the conflict from Gaza into Lebanon. What is Hezbollah going to do? What is the stance that Iran is going to take? What could happen on Syria? All of those concerns are, of course, uppermost in the minds of the world. India's own stance on this continues to be somewhat nuanced and increasingly nuanced. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had, of course, begun just after the October 7th terror attack by Hamas with this very clear condemnation of terrorism. This is the tweet he had put out on the 7th of October. But subsequently, India has also been talking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also tweeted about his interaction with the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and the fact that he is going on expressing India's long-standing situation on the Palestinian issue. And now for the very latest on the situation in Israel and also in the Gaza Strip, I'm now being joined by my colleague, Jody Cohen. Jody, what can you tell us?
Hi Vikram, Sue asked what the current situation is like in Israel, and I'll just give you an idea of the updates that we've seen in the past 4 hours alone from the Israel Defense Forces. Now, firstly, Israeli troops came under attack on the Lebanese border. They returned fire, and there is currently a search for potential infiltrators into northern Israel. Israel also had a barrage of rockets into the south and centre of the country, with Hamas claiming to have targeted Jerusalem, which, remember, contains the sites holy to Judaism, Christianity and Islam. The Israeli police said they found 4 Gazans hiding in the southern town of Beersheba, and following thousands of Hamas terrorists infiltrating into Israel in the 7th of October attack, it's thought that perhaps dozens remain inside Israel. Now, following rockets from Gaza and Lebanon, the IDF says it struck Hamas and Hezbollah targets overnight and are evacuating more residents from the north of the country to the centre, as they have done with residents in the south. In addition, the IDF says Israel is gearing up for potential attacks by the Iranian-backed Houthis after the US Navy intercepted missiles and drones from Yemen, which were thought to be heading towards Israel. So Israel is dealing with infiltrators within Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah, rockets across the country, and is now facing the prospect of others potentially joining in. So it's certainly a tense time. This is Jodie Cohen for WION World as One.
Well, there's been so much talk in recent days about human rights and what should human rights be and how can they be protected? How do you prevent a humanitarian crisis like what we are seeing in West Asia at the present moment? Also, what exactly does the rule of law actually mean? This has been a very major subject of discussion in multiple forums over the last few days. So for more on that, we're now being joined by Niamh Gordon, who's a professor of human rights law at the Queen Mary University in London. Professor Gordon, thank you so much for joining us. What is your, as a professor of human rights law, what is your understanding of the situation that we are seeing right now? Both the terror attacks that we saw, the Hamas terror attacks, and the humanitarian crisis that we are seeing now in Gaza.
It's both human rights law and the laws of war, international humanitarian law. And according to the laws of war, it is legal to kill combatants, but it is illegal to kill non-combatants or civilians. So civilians and civilian sites are protected, and acts that deliberately or intend to kill civilians are considered war crimes. So what we saw on Saturday the 7th is clearly an act of war crimes committed by Hamas inside Israel. And immediately following the attack, we have been seeing Israel's response, which has also led to the death of thousands of civilians already. And these two war crimes, because, as I said, civilians, according to international law, are protected.
Now, Professor Gordon, the argument that the Israelis are making in this case is that if in any war, if the combatants, Hamas in this case, are sheltering behind civilians, hiding behind civilians, or in places that have intense civilian populations, then what happens? You can't just carry out a terror attack and say, okay, now we're hiding in civilian neighborhoods and there's nothing that you can now do to us. That's the point the Israelis are making.
Precisely. So what we see today is that many wars today are being carried out in civilian spaces, in cities or outside of cities. And what we see militaries often doing is framing the civilians that are in the cities. Instead of civilians, they're calling them human shields. And they're saying that Hamas is using the Palestinian civilians as human shields to defend against Israeli attacks. And then when Israel shoots at Hamas and kills civilians, Israel claims it is not our fault, it is Hamas's fault because they are hiding behind these civilians. Whereby in international law, it's actually not legal because it contravenes what is called the principle of proportionality, where the attack needs to be carried out in proportion to the damage that is carried out.
Right, you mentioned proportionality, and that concept is being discussed widely in the media also in the recent past. I just wanted to understand from you, legally, what exactly does proportionality mean? I mean, if 1,300 civilians have been killed by Hamas, then does proportionality mean that there are a particular number of Palestinians or civilians who can legitimately be killed or become a target before it actually becomes a war crime? Or if not that, then what does proportionality mean?
So proportionality will not deal with the Israeli citizens that have been killed. It is the assessment or evaluation of what I aim to achieve in attack. So, for example, if the target is a high-ranking Hamas militant, versus the expected amount of civilians that will be killed while I killed the high targeting Hamas militant. And what we see is often in situations of war where a warring party will increase the value of its target in order to suggest that it was proportional. But is it proportional regardless of what we think this target is, the head of Hamas's northern region? Is it proportional to kill him knowing that at the same time I'm going to kill 30 or 40 or 50 civilians? And what we see often is that those civilians, instead of having names and dreams and life stories, are referred to as statistics, as collateral damage, and that just precipitates the cycle of violence. We have to understand that when we shoot, we kill people that have parents and have children and so forth. And what we need now in the Middle East is not the escalation of fighting, but actually a call for de-escalation.
So one other question with some legal implications, I guess, that has to be asked. Supposing, as is happening in this case, the Israelis are saying, you need to evacuate. You need to move out of those areas in the Gaza city as civilians so that you don't get killed when we are attacking. You need to move away. You need to move below the line. You need to go below the Wadi Gaza. Now, many in the Palestinian side will say, how do we do that? Where do we evacuate? There's no place to move out. Strikes are happening even in the south of Gaza. So is this a legitimate thing to say? To say, evacuate. And if you're still there, then in a sense, it's your own fault.
We have a 24-hour evacuation order for 1.1 million people. Many of, half the population in Gaza are children. We have the sickly, we have the elderly. And so trying to move in 24 hours is very difficult. And now we have evidence coming that Israel bombed a convoy of people moving south with killing 70 Palestinians in that bombing.
All right, Professor Gordon, just one last question I wanted to ask you. In the recent past, we've had this entire situation, the row that's taking place between India and Canada on the charges of targeted assassinations, the allegations made by Canada, with no evidence that has been made publicly yet, I must hasten to add, that India struck a person of terrorist sympathies in Canadian soil. Now, I have to say, this has been a subject which many people have been thinking about or discussing about the legal aspects of this. The entire point on targeted assassinations or extrajudicial killings as a concept, as a theory, what does the law say about targeted assassinations of a terrorist as opposed to declaring war and going inside and bombing and blowing up a large number of places? Because you could have one argument saying targeted assassinations are wrong, they run contrary to the laws of war, the rule of law. Another view could potentially be that surely a targeted assassination of a potential terrorist is better than actually going and killing a lot of civilians by declaring war. What does, and this entire issue may come up in Israel also in connection with what Mossad used to do earlier. What does law actually say about all of this?
The law does not allow targeted assassinations except in the context of war where you're targeting a combatant. And so if it's not in the context of war, then what the law requires is due process. You know, you don't say someone is guilty and then kill them. You have to bring them to trial, prove their guilt, and put them in jail for the rest of their life if you manage to prove it. So targeted they're called extrajudicial executions. They're called executions that carried out without recourse to the law, which is extremely problematic.
All right, Professor Gordon, thank you so much. As Professor of Human Rights Law, you've helped us to decode what law actually says about many of these really tricky situations. So thank you so much for being with us. But I was talking about India and Canada, and clearly there's no signs of a thaw in that particular relationship. Winter is not coming when it comes to India-Canada. Winter seems to have come, and it looks as if it's going to be a really cold and a really long winter. Canada's foreign minister now has said that the country has recalled 41 of its diplomats from India. This after the Indian government said it would revoke the diplomatic immunity. India has made it clear to Canada that there has to be a parity. Canada can't have so many diplomats in India, but India only has a certain number in Canada. So the Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, has said that India has informed Canada it would revoke that diplomatic immunity, and as a result, Canada is withdrawing the diplomats. Joly did, however, say that India's decision will impact the level of services given by consulates in both countries. She said that Canada is pausing in-person consular services in Mumbai, Chandigarh and Bangalore. So an escalating crisis between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and of course a diplomatic crisis between India and Canada. Let's get someone in to help us decode all of this. Amarjit Singh Dullat now joining us, former head of RAW and former also special director of the INB. Mr. Dullat, thank you for joining us. I'm going to tap into some of your experience in dealing with some of these issues in a practical manner. We were just hearing some of the legal implications. Let's now turn our attention to the practical aspects of a lot of this. First, that a lot of attention clearly on what's happening in West Asia. First, that terrible terror attack by Hamas, and after that, the Israeli counter-attack and what's the humanitarian crisis with civilians there. What's your own sense of it, and what advice, if any, would you give the Israelis at this point?
This is I'm not a West Asian expert, and I don't know the region at all, but I mean, common sense tells you that, nothing can be forced on anybody, You've got to engage, you've got to talk, you've got to work things out. And actually this Israeli government, which is, they have never had a government as rightist as this. When it came to power, there were generals, Israeli generals, both retired and serving, who expressed apprehensions that, this would lead to a civil war in Israel. Now, that hasn't happened, but a lot of other things are happening. And the whole thing is that, the Palestinians have felt deprived for a long time, and they said this is like apartheid. So unless this Palestinian issue is settled, we'll keep hearing of these problems. Shootouts, killings, attacks. I mean, this kind of attack has never happened on Israeli soil.
Yeah, I guess the Israelis would say that whatever is happening, Hamas brought it on the people of Gaza because of the terror attack. But I just want to talk to you after that terror attack, the Israeli response to that. Now, if you look at India's own reaction, for example, there's been some talk about this. India no stranger to terrorism. India has seen very brutal terror attacks. I wanted to get your sense of the Indian response in some of these cases. You were, for example, the head of RAW at the time when the IC-814 hijacking happened. And then there was those terrible Mumbai attacks, 26/11. Now, some commentators have pointed to India's reaction, for example, after 26/11, which wasn't to immediately strike back, perhaps striking back was always difficult because there was Pakistan there which had nuclear weapons. But the way India responded was to use that particular terror attack to build up systematic opinion across the world against Pakistan. And that has then led to a process by which Pakistan has been sidelined on the global stage and successfully painted as a sponsor, state sponsor of terrorism, made into a pariah nation of some sort. So what some commentators are wondering is, was that a better response than what Israel has done by striking so quickly, so hard and so fast at Gaza that attention has become focused a little bit on the civilian casualties that we are seeing in Gaza and not on building up sympathy after what was a really brutal terror attack and also the taking of so many hostages back into Gaza? Did Israel get it slightly wrong? Did it play it wrong after the terror attack?
Yeah, I guess the Israelis were taken so much by surprise, and I think Netanyahu was in a spot, so he had to react. I'm not surprised by that, except that the airstrike which happened yesterday on this Baptist hospital or whatever it is. I want to remind you of something else. You talked about my time in the RNAW, which is very limited. But my contemporary at that time in the Mossad, who served for about 5.5 years as chief there, was a guy called Ephraim Halevi. And he used to say, not once, but he said it repeatedly, and there were other Mossad chiefs as well, who used to say that we cannot wish away Hamas, we cannot browbeat Hamas, and we'll have to engage with Hamas. There is no other way. But, opinions change, governments change, thinking changes, so it's that kind of thing.
Mr. Dullah, do you have a view on how Mossad, which is reputed to be one of the best intelligence agencies in the world, and the rest of Israel's security apparatus, again reputed to be one of the best in the world, the cyber security and other things that Israel has, how were they taken by surprise in this sort of a manner? I mean, frankly, India has also been taken by surprise on many occasions. This scale, 1,300 terrorists coming across, no warning being given, a somewhat delayed response in dealing with them. How do you think this happened?
Absolutely. I mean, they were totally surprised. And I think heads are going to roll. I'd be surprised if the Prime Minister survives after all this. It'll take a while, but I think heads are going to roll.
So let me put a slightly different question to you now. I mean, you've heard what Justin Trudeau and Canada are accusing India, and more specifically, I guess, the agency that you once headed of. They're accusing India of targeted assassinations, very much in what once used to be Mossad mode. How do you react to the sort of allegations that have been made by Canada?
I've never heard of anything like this before attributed to the RNAW, and I have been denying it, and I'll continue to deny it because we've never been involved in anything like this. What I found even more surprising was that Prime Minister Trudeau had to go to his House of Commons to say all this. These things happen from time to time, and we've sent people back home, not only Pakistanis, but Americans, Chinese, Russians, from here, but it's done quietly, And people are told that this guy is no good and we're going to pack him off. And there's normally tit for tat, which is all right, but it's done quietly. It's not done in Parliament or so much talk about it. Sometimes it doesn't even come out in the media even.
All right, Mr. Dullah, thank you so much, sir, for joining us and giving us the benefit of your experience in all of these matters. Thank you for being with us. Let's move to our special focus this week. In a major decision that came as a big disappointment for millions of members of the LGBTQ community in India, India's Supreme Court refused to legalize gay marriages in the country. The 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court on October the 17th said that the law does not recognize same-sex marriages, but it did stress that an individual's right to enter into a relationship cannot be restricted on the basis of sexual orientations. The bench also declined adoption rights for queer couples, that by a 3-2 split verdict. The apex court did hand over the power to Parliament, asking the government to set up a panel to consider granting the community more legal rights, rights like ration cards, enabling queer couples to nominate for joint bank accounts, pensions, and so on and so forth. The top court has also said that same-sex couples cannot enter into a civil union, that again by a 3-2 split verdict, but it said that states can pass a law in the absence of a central law. However, championing the rights of gay couples, Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud in his minority judgment countered the centre's view that the petitions reflect urban elitist views, saying that homosexuality is not an urban context and it is not restricted just to privileged sections. Well, to understand more about the judgment and what legal options lie ahead for the community, we are joined by Anjali Gopalan, a human rights activist and the founder and executive director of the NAS Foundation, and also by Geeta Bhatt, professor of the University of Delhi. Anjali Gopalan, if I could just start with you. You've had a couple of days to digest the judgment. What do you think lies ahead? What are the next steps?
Well, clearly there's a tremendous sense of disappointment, right? Because I think this was an opportunity the courts had to at least look at some civil rights for the community. I understand the pushback on marriage. I get it that people go into a tizzy around the institution of marriage and they don't want to touch it and all of that. But to deny rights to citizens, to deny rights to certain citizens based on who they love or who they're with really doesn't make sense to me. But having said that, to me, the really sad bit is not doing anything around civil rights.
Well, Geeta, the verdict that Anjali ji is describing as sad has been, of course, welcomed by other sections of society, and they're saying that it was the right thing to have done. Why do you think this was a good judgment?
What is my perception about this, this whole case being filed and a constitution bench which being constituted for looking into this, regular hearings taking place, and the demand to basically make this incorporation in the Special Marriage Act. Because you see, if we want to bring the these kind of provisions, then there is a very thorough exercise that needs to be done in terms of looking into various provisions of law. Because there are various provisions of laws which provide protection to women. And even today, women itself, they are also in many ways very vulnerable community and they need protection. So without going through that exercise, taking a shortcut by asking that provision to be made in the Special Marriage Act, where the Special Marriage Act itself was brought so that the religious identities of individuals could be protected while they get into a union.
Right, and what you're saying is essentially what the judgment said, and it's on the question of marriage, and it comes to the Special Marriage Act. And I'm going to be trying to see in the next 5-10 minutes where there's a possibility of moving forward in other areas and where there is actually no consensus. So, Anjali, if I could actually come back to you, what Geeta just said is what the courts were saying about the problems when it comes to marriage, the problems of amending the Special Marriage Act, the fact that it's eventually for Parliament to try and figure out all of those complexities around the question of marriage. So, yes, on marriage, there are certain issues. Do you agree with that particular point, the point that was being made by Geeta ji right now about how it would have been tough to have amended the Special Marriage Act?
It's her thinking, it's her opinion, it's her belief, and that's fine. All I'm saying is that the courts could have looked at civil rights. They could have looked at civil unions. So the benefits of marriage which are denied to the community, and the trans community is a little bit outside of this now, because the courts very clearly, they clarified what the NALSA judgment had given. And it clearly said that as a trans person, today you can marry another trans person, or a cisgender person. You can marry a heterosexual person, right? So I think it's a bit different for the trans community. But the rest of the community have been denied very basic rights. Now, Vikram, something as small as if your partner is sick and in hospital, the right to take care of them can also be denied to an individual.
But it sounds to me, Geetaji, if I can just read between the lines of what you're saying, is that if this government committee actually does come forward and give the sort of rights that Anjali ji was talking about, it's not that there would be a lot of objection to that. You also agree that certain rights and certain protections should be provided to people of a different sexual orientation.
Yeah. Definitely. This kind of a provision where, for example, like Anjali ji said that if one is hospitalized and one have to, but there were various other arguments like you can't open a bank account together, and that is, I mean, you see, there are various other laws which do make these kind of provision, like two people coming together and opening a bank account. I mean, there is no legal barring on it. Any two people can come together and open a bank account. Right, buy a property. You can write a will for anyone, of your choice. So these type of provisions are already there. But yes, some, for example, this particular case where there is a hospitalization and you have to kind of sign on the, on the papers for some kind of exigency, emergency. Then these kind of, but some of the provisions I feel which already are taken within the ambit of the various provisions which are already there in the law.
Anjali,
For buying of property, for example, two people can buy property together. I mean, for that, you don't need any special provision.
So, but you can't buy it as a couple. So, and there are therefore other consequences to that, no? So the whole idea is what you can do as a couple becomes very important.
So,
and
just to understand,
Geetaji, it's not easy to open a bank account as a couple. It's not easy, it doesn't exist. We have to constantly fight in the banks to get a couple to open an account together. Doesn't happen.
I think the reason I'm trying to figure out to see if there's any possible consensus and a possible way forward is because for a lot of people in the LGBTQ community, it's a sense of it's the end of the world after that particular judgment. It's all dark. I'm just trying to see if there's a glimmer of light in the rulings. So, Anjali ji, supposing this committee is to give some sort of a ruling on certain rights, and also the possibility that then gets thrown open is, let's see if there can be some sort of a law around possible civil union, what the minority judgment was hoping for, asking for. Do you think that would make people feel a lot more hopeful?
I think so. It would be a step forward. It's not what people aspire to, and many people do want marriage equality, right? And of course, it's not a monolith community. So there are some who say, fine, this is fine with us, but the rest will say we do want marriage. Now, the whole thing around marriage is what? Is that society, in a culture like us, society accepts you as a couple. It's a way to show someone you really care about them and love them and all the rest of those good things. But the way I look at it, even if the rights that we've discussed, if that happens, if this committee that we were talking about ensures that these rights are given to the community, I think it'll be a one step forward.
All right, on the question of adoption, which was the other somewhat sensitive question, in which again there was a divergence of views in the judgment. The majority said no to adoption, the minority view said yes, it should be there. Geetaji, what would be the problems with adoption? Why do you feel that adoption rights should not be provided?
See, adoption is something which I think sometime back government also came out, in the adoption policy and in the act, they made certain amendments to ensure that the adoption takes place, in a rightful manner. And because you see, it is important to understand that when the law is trying to protect a child, it is by assuming that the child is not capable of going into any kind of a contract, is not capable of going into a contract. And also children, they cannot be exposed, or how do you expose them to gender fluidity? And there were in the judgment, when there were arguments going on, there were various studies which were submitted which are there in the judgment. And these studies, these studies have been conducted outside India, but they, in a way, they were pointing to the fact that those children who have been brought up in, in a union where there are people of alternate orientations, the results were not very positive, and this has been submitted even in the court. There are, the kind of misuse that can happen if such provisions are made for adoption is something that needs to be very, very carefully undertaken, because this could be really misused. So that is why, I mean, one has to be very, very cautious if one is asking for adoption, and the legislation has to look into drafting, if they ever come out with any such provision, in a very, very careful manner, because this can be really misused.
But that is misused by anyone, right? Why are you saying it will only be misused by a certain community? Number two, the way our adoption laws are right now, single people can adopt. If you're in a live-in relationship, you can't. And now, of course, if you are from the LGBTQ, not the T, but the rest of the community, you can't. Now, there, as you said, some studies were produced in the court, but I can give you a slew of studies which says exactly the opposite of that. We have many friends who are bringing up children in a really loving, caring environment, because that's what children want. So to assume that just because you are of the same sex, you can't provide that kind of environment is wrong. Actually, if you sit in those family courts, if you've ever been to Delhi family court, it's one of the most bizarre things to go through. Here there are married couples, and what they put their children through is a big problem. So this whole assumption that we have, I think the response is a very visceral response, right? But if you think it through a bit logically, and I agree with you, of course, adoption laws should be well drafted and make sure that the protection of the child is key to it, right? But the assumption, I think, is problematic. And those laws are critical, they are important. I'm not saying no, but please believe me when I say that in this country, I run a home for children who are orphaned, and I know what happens to these children. They are languishing in orphanages when there are so many homes and so many people who will provide that loving, caring environment for them. So why is it that, what is holding us back? What are we scared about? I agree with you. Make it stringent, make the laws strong. We must have strong laws. We must protect our children. But don't do what we're doing right now.
All right, Anjali Gopal and Geeta, thank you so much for joining us. And let me turn now to another verdict that has once again put the spotlight on what is probably one of the biggest issues with the entire India story, and that is the judicial system, the nature of police investigations, and the slow pace of actually concluding anything in the criminal judicial system. The discovery of human remains from a drain near a pack of sleepy villages called Nithari, not far away from the national capital, New Delhi. Understandably, there was shock and outrage and an unequivocal demand to bring the culprits to justice. For 2 years, many poor villagers had run from pillar to post, filed complaints with the police, as their children had vanished in thin air. There were assurances, but no results, until one day, the parents of a missing girl reported that they knew the location of the remains of the missing children. And in a cold December in 2006, the sensational killings came to light with the discovery of the skeletal remains of 8 children from a drain that ran behind the house of businessman Maninder Singh Pandey in Noida's Sector 31. Subsequent diggings led to the unearthing of more human remains. To be precise, 19 skulls were found. And as the Uttar Pradesh police continued to face heat, Pandey and his domestic help, Surinder Kohli, emerged as the prime suspects, Kohli in particular. Accused of abducting and raping children and women, committing acts of cannibalism and disposing of their bodies in a drain in the locality, The duo was arrested on December the 29th, 2006, as the police came under fire for its dismal probe. And the Central Bureau of Investigation took over the investigation 10 days after the arrest. The probe agency filed 16 FIRs against Kohli and his employer Pandey. They were also booked in a case of trafficking human remains. The belongings of the dead found in the Sector 31 drain, confessions, narco analysis of the accused were all produced as evidences. And in 2009, a court pronounced the duo guilty and gave them a death sentence. The verdict was challenged, and the Allahabad High Court this week acquitted both Kohli and Pandey for a lack of evidence. Now, it has to be noted that they were sentenced to death. The Supreme Court upheld the death sentence, and the president rejected a mercy petition. Kohli was set to be hanged in 2014, acquitted now in 2013. Before I set out to raise some pertinent questions around all of this, let me read from a remark from the two-judge bench which acquitted the duo. I quote, "The failure of the prosecution was nothing short of a betrayal of public trust by responsible agencies." End quote. An 18-year wait for the families of the murdered children has ended up in the acquittal of the only two people accused, the only two people who stood trial in the case. This isn't just a case of justice being delayed, but certainly of justice being denied. The biggest question that we have to now ask is, who murdered these children then? Who should the poor families from Nettari blame? The judicial system, the probe agencies, the two people who had once been convicted of this. Does the Nettari verdict, in a sense, point to our misplaced trust in the judicial system and in the investigating agencies? This is not an isolated case. So many cases. We keep on talking about them right here on the India Story. What can be done to enhance the common man's trust in these most basic of institutions, the criminal investigation system and the criminal judicial system? I'm going to throw some of those questions to one of the top experts in all of this, someone who's also been writing extensively on this and other cases, Sanjay Hegde, senior advocate of the Supreme Court. All right, Sanjay, probably one of the most gruesome cases of serial killings that we have seen in this country. And just look at this as an example of delayed justice being denied justice, right? 2005, 2006 are the killings. 2009, a sentence of death. 2014 is when the execution is supposed to be carried out. The Supreme Court, the president, they've all rejected mercy petitions. And now in 2023, they're acquitted. Somewhere you have to worry about the process of justice and the process of investigation. How can these things happen?
Well, this is an extreme case, but yes, the system of justice does get extremely delayed. What happens is that you may have a reasonably quick trial. The trial happens very often in the district wherever the episode has happened. Thereafter, when a matter goes to the high courts are all clogged up. The systems are clogged up. The litigation there is clogged up, and depending on whether somebody is out on bail or not on bail, you end up with an appeal being heard very late. In this particular case, it does appear that there were 2 or 3 trials. In one of them, there was a sentence. That sentence was not carried out due to other reasons, and in the meanwhile, these appeals continue. And in this set of appeals, now the court has looked at the prosecution evidence very closely and basically told the prosecutors, you did a lousy job. You did not collect evidence as was required by you, required of you by the law. And as a consequence, the only thing to do is to acquit the man. This is possible because what would have happened is that once they arrested the man in one case and decided to charge him with all the murders in that area or try to identify all the bodies. It was somebody in the system possibly got lazy. They said the evidence in one would suffice for the rest, and that's not how it is done.
Right, now the judiciary often gets the rap and the clogged up systems, why are things taking so long? Now in this case, of course, the acquittal is also because they're questioning the entire nature of the investigation. So it has to be said that there doesn't seem to be any system of accountability when it comes to investigation. If there are police officers or other investigators who bungled the investigation, what happens then? Because we're having it both ways. Sometimes people are being let off because the investigation wasn't properly done. On the other hand, people sometimes rot in jail for a long period of time when they're actually innocent. In either case, justice is being denied. So at some point, there should be some accountability for whoever's responsible for this.
Yes, because a lot of stuff gets compartmentalized. People do their investigating job, and then they just pass it to the court system. There's nobody who sees a case through from start to finish. More likely, it is going to be the defense lawyer who's continually on the case. Whereas on the investigation side, the prosecution side, people keep changing. And there will always be a tendency to blame the predecessor. The man who investigated is more likely to have gone out of the system either through retirement or death. And since there is nobody to blame, nobody gets blamed.
So, Sahigde, if you look at this particular case, which was once considered an open and shut case, allegations of torture, allegations that not enough evidence was collected properly, allegations that things were not done in the proper manner, going from one investigating officer from another, I am still coming back to the basic question. How do you find a solution for this? And is the answer in fixing accountability in some form or the other?
See, the solution actually would be, first, you would have to trust your prosecutors. You would have to, especially in gross cases, you would have to have a prosecutor who would be associated with the case right from the stage of the investigation. Somebody who could then game the process or visualize as to what are the questions that will be asked by a court, which is asking tough questions. Very often what happens is that the prosecuting team thinks that it has done its job by filing a charge sheet. And the charge sheet is often nothing more than a compendium of an undigested mass of documents and witness statements. What is the story of the prosecution which will ultimately result in a conviction and which will, where all the proof required is laid out in the manner as required by law? There is no stress check of anything that the investigators find. That has to be the first thing. Secondly, not every case needs to go to court for a trial. The system of plea bargaining, which is prevalent abroad, would possibly be a much better situation in India if only people and administrations could trust prosecutors. Because prosecutors right now do not get into the system of using their discretion and saying, okay, if you plead guilty to we will suggest lesser time and get convictions. Here, everybody seems to factor in the thing that the ultimate result will arrive at some uncertain point in the very distant future.
Yeah.
So therefore, they do what they think is sufficient unto the day and evil thereof, and then forget about it.
And let's face it, that system actually works very well for someone who is guilty. If the person is guilty, they're happy with the situation. But 30 years from now, 25 years from now, you may or you may not get punished. Witnesses could die, something else could happen. But if you're innocent, then it's really terrible because you have a shadow hanging over your head, or even worse, you could be in jail for something which you haven't done in the first place.
Absolutely. we also have a system of bail in this country where bails are not given, or the thumb rule of judges is that, okay, if you've sort of served 3/4 of your sentence, maybe we'll give you bail, or you've served half your sentence, maybe we'll give you bail. So it runs havoc with the presumption of innocence.
Wow, it looks like a really sad situation. Let's hope something gets done now. What do you think is going to happen in the Editorji cases? Will there be any justice? In a sense, there, I guess you could argue that they have done X number of years in prison, so that's some punishment in case they're guilty. It's not punishment in case they're innocent. But what do you think is going to happen here?
No, as far as this particular judgment is concerned, I fully expect the prosecution to appeal. In the appeal, it's hardly likely that Mr. Pandey, who's got out after 17 years, will be asked to go back to prison while the appeal is finally heard someday. Kohli remains in prison, so it is possible that the court might say that, okay, we'll consider the appeal. As to when that consideration will happen in the Supreme Court, I despite being a 30-year practitioner in the court, I can't make a forecast.
All right, Sanjay Hegde, thank you so much for joining us with that particular perspective. You know, I have to say, the India story is doing so well because we've been able to fix so many critical, important problems: digitization, the digital revolution, infrastructure. So many of those things have been fixed. The criminal judicial system, perhaps that one big item on the agenda that still needs to be fixed, which is why we'll keep coming back to it again and again on this program. But that's it for now on the India story. We'll be back next week.